3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
Ask not
to remind the current regime
what your country...
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
New Year's Day this year, while every American should have been looking forward to what the year may bring, was marred by two terrorist attacks, one in New Orleans and one in Las Vegas. Such tragedies leave deep confusion and fear in communities, and that is by design. To understand more about why these attacks are happening and the dynamics that drive them, I sat down with Jim Carafano, an expert on national security and foreign policy and a senior fellow here at the Heritage Foundation, to learn more. Jim Carafano, welcome back to Heritage Explains.
You know, it's not only an honor to be here, I think it's really important to be here because you guys are amazing. I mean, you've reached so many people. I think this is a great program. I don't understand what podcasts are, but a lot of other people apparently do. And this is a real good use of your time. So thanks for what you guys have done. You've created an amazing service, I think.
That is great to hear, and thank you. We really appreciate you coming on the show, sharing your wisdom with us. And we want to start today with a pretty tragic incident from a couple of weeks ago. As many folks know, on New Year's Day, there was a tragic terrorist attack on Bourbon Street in New Orleans. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
So there are actually two, because we tend to forget this, but the Vegas attack and the New Orleans attack happened the same day. And it's both important to look at them in context. And the first and most important takeaway from this is these were not domestic terrorist attacks. Even if they're done by individuals inside the United States who are U.S. citizens, these are linked to foreign attacks against the United States. So these are transnational foreign terrorist attack. And if you think back to the biggest analogy for this is if you remember many years ago under President Obama, we had an officer at Fort Hood, Texas, take out a gun and just start shooting other soldiers at Fort Hood, Texas. He had basically radicalized and organized his own terrorist attack as part of a global jihad against the United States. That was a foreign terrorist attack that took place on U.S. soil by an American citizen who planned, organized, and executed the attack himself. And if you remember, the response to the Obama administration was to actually deny first that this was a terrorist attack, and then to deny that it was actually linked to foreign terrorism against the United States. So what happened, and what's striking is the similarities in the two cases, and we still don't really know how linked they are, but we do know that they are synchronized. This remarkable thing that we had two very similar attacks happen on the same day. So in New Orleans, you had a situation where an individual took a vehicle, plowed through a bunch of people, and then had a gun, was going to shoot people, and he also had explosives. So the idea was that you would injure additional people. So it was an attack that was designed to not only hit a high-profile target in a place where people thought they were safe, to make Americans feel less vulnerable, but also designed to elicit the maximum number of casualties possible. And what's interesting and significant about that is if you look at what he did, everything is things we've seen before. As a matter of fact, we just recently had a terrorist attack in Europe where a guy drove a vehicle into a Christmas market. So the use of the vehicle, drive over people, integrating explosives and weapons, hitting high-profile vulnerable targets. This is something we've seen before, and it's kind of following tried and true terrorist practices that are both proven and relatively simple for somebody to master. The idea is obviously a little more sophisticated, but that's not rocket science. What's very, very similar about the attack in Los Angeles, both people with previous military experience who became radicalized. We don't really understand from all the evidence how that happened, We still don't understand the degree to which, even though they operated as individuals, which they have been connected with, planned either with each other or with other people. But again, following a very distinctive pattern, not similar to what we saw in Fort Hood, very similar to what we saw in the Boston Marathon bombing, where an individual drove a cyber truck up in front of the Trump Hotel in Vegas and first committed suicide and then simultaneously wanted to do a car bomb in front of the hotel. Again, tried and proven tactics that we've seen before, also designed to elicit the maximum number of casualties. So what we have here is a pattern of a resurgence of Islamist-related terrorism tied to larger global events using tried and proven tactics. So it's something that we haven't seen. I'll just tell you this very quickly is one day I was in the hallway at Heritage after 9/11. Somebody stopped me up and somebody said, how many terrorist plots have there been post 9/11? And I reeled off a number. Well, I think 11 right off the top of my head, because I thought, well, doesn't everybody know this? Because obviously I was tracking these things. And it turned out that no, nobody was actually tracking that. So at Heritage, we created an index of Islamist-inspired terrorist attack aimed at the United States post 9/11. And we kept track of that. And a lot of people didn't, because a lot of them were foiled, right? But we did that. And the number was striking. I mean, I think we were up over 100. And we stopped counting during the Trump administration for the simple reason that there were none. And it was like, why are you maintaining a database where there's no data? So we just stopped counting. And now I think that's over. I think we're back in an age where global terrorism, specifically designed to come to U.S. soil, is back on people's agenda. And there's a number of reasons for that. We can talk about that.
So it seemed one of the things that got a lot of attention about the New Orleans attack in particular is that officials seemed very intent to, or at least somewhat intent, to obscure the Islamic connection. For instance, there was an ISIS flag on the back of the truck that was utilized. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe what motivated that?
Well, one is, look, you never want to get out ahead of the evidence, because that's always a mistake, right? So you want to tell people what you know, when you know it, as long as it doesn't impede the investigation. But that's the best practice. And hopefully some of it was trying to follow that. But I will say on the other hand, look, this administration that we've just had doesn't want to say there are Islamist-related terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, because that's on their watch and it's their fault. And they've been telling us for 4 years that this is not an issue, that if you talk about Islamist terrorism, that you're actually xenophobic or Islamophobic, right? And so it's evil to do that. And that the real domestic terrorist threat is right-wing terrorism. And we can talk about what that really is. And so this doesn't fit their narrative. It doesn't make them look good. So there's this reflexive thing not to want to do that. So I don't think it's a reflective of good police work and saying, well, we don't want to give out information that we don't know is accurate. I do think it's a political agenda which says we don't want this to seem like exactly what it is, which is we've failed. You know, I've said this statement repeatedly, and I totally believe that it's true. If you look at everything that we put in place post 9/11 to prevent another 9/11, and I won't say all of it was great or smart, right? But everything that we did in the last 4 years, most of that has been dissolved, deactivated, demobilized, distracted, or diverted for other things. And to the point where I believe that the Homeland Security structure that we put together post 9/11 has largely been evaporated. And that I believe that you are more vulnerable to a terrorist attack today in the United States than you were on September 11th, 2001, specifically because of the policies and acts of this administration.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the people who are perpetrating these acts? What is the underlying philosophy, the radicalism that's actually animating? What is their goal?
Well, I think these particular acts are part of what you would call a global intifada or global jihad, that they're being organized in support and sympathy of things like the attacks on Israel, particularly in the Middle East. Here's where I think it's important for people to understand. We often talk about left-wing terrorism and right-wing terrorism. But the reality is those are bad labels, because it associates the terrorists with the political movements, which may or may not be true. This is particularly true in the case of what's typically called right-wing terrorists. If you think of white supremacists, or if you think, for example, of the Murrah office bombing, or there's this recent film about The Order, about the people that killed Alan Berg. If you actually look at these people, we call them right-wing terrorists, but the reality is they're not really part of the political right. Matter of fact, they hate government. They hate all governments. They hate Republicans just as much as they hate Democrats. So it's a statement that they're not really associated with the right. They're really off the right? But they are a small subset of individual groups that are isolated. And matter of fact, if you actually look at The Order, for example, the guys that killed Alan Berg, they were actually trying to connect with the Syrians and the Iranians. So they go, oh, well, you guys hate Jews, we hate Jews, let's work together and kill them. So they actually wanted to team up with the Islamist terrorists to attack Americans. What's going on here with this global intifada is something different. And it's even different from what we saw in 9/11 with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Al-Qaeda and ISIS were trying to mobilize global attacks in support of building this kind of larger caliphate. What we have here is terrorism that associated with something called the global intifada, which is this movement really to destroy Israel. And the difference is unlike the Order or the Ku Klux Klan or something else, these are not isolationist independent groups. This is linked into a global political network. For example, CARE, which is the Arab American Association, which is legally organized in the United States, which, by the way, was accused of and designated as providing material support to terrorism, which was an organization which was invited by the United States to actually participate in writing a report on anti-Semitism in the United States. These are people that are plugged into the political networks. These are people actually funded by people like George Soros and the Open Society Foundation. They're actually drawing funds from that. These are groups that, by the way, are also in many cases linked to foreign powers, including the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians, who have no problem funding any group that wants to weaken or attack the United States. So these are, one is they're networked globally. Two is this is top down. These are not people like the civil rights movement in the 1960s, like, oh, look at this broad injustice that I see in my community. Let me go and sit at a lunch counter. This is not bottoms up advocacy. This is top down political indoctrination and mobilization and activism that is driving this network to attack the United States. This is a real serious problem. It's been building for decades. It's different from Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But now what we see is we have two things going on simultaneously. We have this global intifada, but we also see the resurgence of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS because of the chaos that we're seeing in post-Afghanistan and in places like the Middle East.
So we're standing here on the eve of the second inauguration of Donald Trump. And obviously, I think we can expect to see some policy changes in this area. What do you expect to see over the next couple of weeks and months?
Well, I do expect them actually to get it right. And the reason for that is they've actually got experience at doing this, and they did it for 4 years and did it pretty successfully. I think we have to make a distinction between some of the things we did in the global war on terrorism and what we did during the Trump era we're likely to see again. I think part of where the global war on terrorism kind of went off track was it became not just about defeating these networks like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but it came about defeating generally the Islamist ideology. And that devolved into then saying, okay, well, we have to deal with the root causes of this. And all of a sudden we're saying, well, if we want to stop terrorism in the United States, we have to deal with the terrorists in Somalia and all these other places. I think that's a dead end. I'm not saying that there aren't local reasons that generate terrorism in different places, but global terrorism, the idea where it is, it doesn't matter if I'm attacking a target in Paris or New York or in Gaza, it's all entitled part of the same ends. The way you address that is not through root causes. I mean, you're not going to eliminate all the terrorism in the world, so forget it. It's just like trying to eliminate all poverty in the world. The root causes, so forget that. What you want to do is you want to take down the network and capabilities that allow terrorists to globalize. And on the high side, that's the offensive part of that. And then the defensive part of that is you don't want to make their job easy. Just like the guy who says, we're not going to criminalize anything that anybody steals that's less than $1,000. And we're not going to prosecute people that pickpocket, shoplift. and we're not going to put anybody in jail, and we're not going to require bond, right? And then shockingly, crime explodes, right? If you make a terrorist job easy, you're going to like to see more terrorists. So there are common sense things you do. You don't want to impinge on people's freedom. You don't want to add things which are stupid and needless. But you don't want to make the terrorist job easy. There's a reason why there's a security guard, at in front of in a store, right? You're telling the guy, this is not an easy target, go someplace else. So, and those are the things I think we can expect from the Trump administration. They're going to go after the people that sponsor. They're going to go after the networks on the high end, and they're going to do the things on the other end, the defensive measures that make the terrorist job easier. So these are pretty obvious. There are things like border security, not having masses of illegal population in your country that you have no accountability over, protecting the infrastructure. Actually, just getting law enforcement back to the day job of doing law enforcement, investigating crimes, prosecuting people, these are the kind of things that are going to make this a less soft target. Like, if you ever watch lions hunt, all right, they don't chase a whole army of zebras. They find the one animal that's off by itself, that's looking around like he's lost, right? And that's the one they eat, right? You don't want to be that guy. And they're going to make America not that guy.
Jim Carafano, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Jim Carafano for his contribution to this episode. You can find more analysis by Jim at heritage.org, or you can follow him on X at JJCarafano. And thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.